Morning after the engagement party, I called my financial advisor and said 4 words. Start the process. Everything. She paused for exactly 2 seconds. She'd known me for 19 years. She knew I didn't say things like that unless I meant them. All of it, Bev. All of it. I hung up and stood at my kitchen window, looking out at the backyard I'd tended for 31 years. The rose bushes my late husband Walter had planted the spring before he got sick. The old cedar fence that needed replacing, but I kept patching because I liked the way it looked worn. A cup of red rose tea going cold on the counter because I'd forgotten it was there. I wasn't angry. That surprised me more than anything. I had been angry the night before for about 20 minutes, in the car on the way home, alone, with the radio off. Then something settled, something got very quiet and very clear. Let me back up. My name is Beverly. I'm 63 years old. For the past 11 years, I have worked part-time at the front desk of the Oakdale Public Library in Oakdale, Ontario, a small city about 90 minutes west of Toronto. I stamp returns, help seniors use the printers, recommend Patricia Cornwell novels to women who haven't read in a while. I bring homemade butter tarts on the last Friday of every month. The other staff call me Bev from Holds, which I find genuinely funny. I drive a 2014 Civic with a dent in the rear bumper from a parking lot incident in 2019 that I never got around to fixing. I wear sensible shoes. I shop at no frills. I have a senior's card at Tim Hortons, even though I'm not quite old enough for one yet. The cashier just started giving it to me one day and I didn't correct her. What nobody at the library knows, what my neighbors don't know, what the woman at my church who organizes the potlucks doesn't know, is that I am worth somewhere in the range of $3.5 million. Walter built a tool and die shop in the 1980s when everyone said manufacturing was dying. He built it quietly, stubbornly, the way he did everything. When he passed in 2008, he left me the business, a paid-off house, 2 rental properties in Kitchener, and a portfolio our accountant described at the time as comfortably diversified. I sold the business 2 years later to a firm in Guelph for more than I expected. I kept the rental properties. I kept the portfolio. I kept the house and the rose bushes and the cedar fence. I didn't tell many people, not because I was ashamed, because I had watched money change people, had seen what it did to families, how it shifted who people were when they thought they were talking to someone with means. I wanted to know who my people really were. I wanted my daughter to have a mother, not a bank. My daughter's name is Claudia. She's 34. She works in marketing at a firm in Hamilton. She's sharp, funny when she wants to be, and has her father's stubbornness in the best and worst ways. She has been the whole of my world since Walter died. I drove to Hamilton every second Sunday for 3 years after the funeral, just to sit on her couch and watch whatever she had on TV. That was how we got through it. Together. She started seeing a man named Fletcher about 2 years ago. Fletcher works in commercial real estate in Mississauga. He wears the kind of shirts that don't wrinkle. He calls me Beverly with a slight emphasis that makes it sound like a correction. His parents are Reg and Maureen, and they live in a large new build in Oakville with a 3-car garage and a kitchen island the size of a boat. I tried. I want to be honest about that. I tried with Fletcher. I tried with his parents. I went to dinners. I brought wine. The good kind, not that I said so. I asked questions about their renovation and listened to the answers. I complimented the kitchen island. It is genuinely a very large island. The engagement party was held at Reg and Maureen's house. Mid-October, a Saturday, 40-some guests, most of them from Fletcher's side, catered, white linens, a bartender, the kind of party I have attended maybe a handful of times in my life, and each time felt like I had wandered into a movie set. I wore my Goodwill blazer, navy blue. I'd had it for 8 years, but it fits well, and I'd had it pressed. I brought a card with a check inside, a generous check, the kind a person writes when they want their daughter to know she is loved. The amount was between me and Claudia. I was standing near the fireplace talking to a woman named Sandra, one of Maureen's friends from the neighborhood, when I heard Maureen say my name, not loudly, but clearly. I've spent years at a library front desk. I can hear a whispered conversation from 30 feet. She was talking to a woman I didn't know, someone from Fletcher's extended family. She was explaining who I was. I heard the words, "works at a library," and then a small pause, and then, "she seems sweet. I just hope she won't feel out of place," and then something I can only describe as a gentle laugh, the kind that means you know how it is. The other woman said something I couldn't make out. Then Maureen said, "We just want the wedding to be a certain way, you know, the photos especially." Claudia agrees. I set my glass of Pinot down on the mantel. Sandra was still talking. I smiled at her and excused myself to find the restroom. I stood in their powder room, marble countertop, a diffuser, monogrammed hand towels, and I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. And then I thought about Claudia, about whether she had said those things or agreed to them or just stayed quiet while her future mother-in-law suggested her own mother didn't fit the aesthetic of her wedding photos. I came out and found my daughter by the bar. She looked happy. She was laughing at something Fletcher had said. I watched her for a moment and I loved her so much it made my chest ache. Then I went and found Maureen. I wasn't cold, I wasn't dramatic. I said, "Thank you for a lovely evening. I'll be heading out." She seemed surprised. It was barely 8 o'clock. She said something warm and reflexive about being so glad I came. I hugged Claudia. She whispered, "You okay, Mum?" And I said yes. I was just tired. On the drive home, I was angry for about 20 minutes. Then it got quiet. Then I called my financial advisor the next morning. What Maureen didn't know, what Claudia had never thought to ask, really, in the comfortable assumption of children that parents are simply the people who raise them and have no other dimensions, was that those 2 rental properties in Kitchener had gone up significantly, that the portfolio Walter had built and I had quietly maintained had compounded for 15 years, that I owned my house outright, that I had no debt, that the past 2 years I had been sitting with my accountant every January and discussing what I was eventually going to do with all of it. Claudia had never asked. I had never offered. That was my choice, and I don't blame her for it. But she also had never asked, because it had never occurred to her that there was anything to ask. I drove a 2014 Civic with a dent in the bumper. I worked the library desk and brought butter tarts. What I had quietly been doing for the past 18 months was looking at a small commercial property on King Street in Oakville. Not for any particular reason at first. I walked past it once on the way to a dentist appointment, and something about it caught my eye. An older 2-story building, the kind with character, with a retail unit on the ground floor and a small apartment above. It had been sitting half-leased and underperforming. My financial advisor thought it was worth a look. My accountant ran numbers. By October, I had made a quiet offer. I was waiting on a response. I want to be careful about what I say next, because I don't want this to sound like a revenge story. That's not what it was, or not entirely. After the engagement party, I sat with my feelings for about 2 weeks. I called my friend Harriet, who has known me since before Walter died, and I talked it through with her. I asked myself honestly whether I was being oversensitive. I went back over what I'd heard. I thought about the monogrammed hand towels and the gentle laugh and the words, "the photos especially." Claudia agrees. Then I called Claudia. We met for coffee in Hamilton, a place we used to go together on Sunday afternoons before Fletcher. I asked her directly. I said, "Has there been any conversation with Maureen about my role at the wedding, about how things should look?" She looked at her cup. That was enough. She said, "Mum, she just means well. She has a vision for the day." I said, "What's the vision?" A long pause. Then she mentioned that the immediate family photos would be just Fletcher's side and the 2 of us. And that for the reception seating, it might be better if you were at a table with the, she searched for the word, the quieter guests. I nodded slowly. Claudia, I said, did you agree to that? She looked up. She had her father's eyes, and in that moment she looked the way she'd looked at 15 when she knew she'd done something that disappointed me. I didn't want to fight, Mum. You know how they are. I don't know how they are, I said quietly, because I've only been treated that way for 2 years, and you've been watching it. She started to say something. I said, I'm not angry. I want you to know that. I love you more than I can say, and I want you to be happy, and I am not going to cause a scene at your wedding or embarrass anyone. But I want you to think about what you just said to me, and I want you to think about whether you're okay with it. I paid for the coffees and I drove home. 2 days later, the offer on the King Street property was accepted. What I did next, and I want to be precise about this because people tend to either overstate or understate these things, was simply proceed with my life. I signed the papers. I engaged a contractor for light renovations. I began the process of transferring my Kitchener properties into a small holding company I'd been setting up with my accountant. I made some decisions about the portfolio that I had been deferring. I also called a realtor about my house, not to sell it, to understand what it was worth. The answer was more than I had realized. Walter had bought it in 1987 for $82,000. In February, I went to see my accountant, a woman named Gail, 68 years old, semi-retired, who has an office above a bakery in Guelph and charges me less than she should. I walked in and sat down and said, Gail, I think it's time we stopped deferring. She looked at me over her glasses. The whole picture. The whole picture. She smiled and opened a folder. What she showed me, organized across a manila folder the way she always organized things, was the sum of 35 years of Walter's work and 15 years of my quiet, unfussy management. The rental income, the portfolio, the new property, the house, the small holdco taking shape. Total, 3.6 million, approximately. I sat with that number for a moment the way you sit with something heavy. Then I said, right. What do I do with it? This was not entirely a financial question. Gail knew that. She said, What do you want it to do? I said, I wanted to do what Walter always said. Money should do. Be useful. Be quiet. Be ready. She nodded. And personally, I thought about the cedar fence I kept patching, the dented bumper, the library desk and the butter tarts. I thought about my daughter agreeing to seat me with the quieter guests. I think, I said, it might be time to fix the fence. Here is what happened in March. Fletcher's parents, Reg and Maureen, had a situation with a property they owned. I learned this not through any scheming on my part, but through a conversation Claudia had with me one evening when she called, which she had started doing more regularly since our coffee. She mentioned carefully that her future in-laws were in a complicated position with a property investment that had gone sideways. A commercial unit in Oakville, a storefront that had been sitting vacant for over a year. They had a balloon payment coming due on their mortgage in the spring, and the rental income they'd counted on hadn't materialized. I stayed very calm during this phone call. The property they were struggling with was on King Street, not the same building I had purchased, 2 doors down, but the same block, the same stretch of underperforming commercial street that I had apparently looked at more carefully than Reg had. I asked Claudia, gently, whether they were looking for help. She said with some discomfort that Fletcher had mentioned the possibility of asking around. I asked what the amount was. She told me. I said I would think about it. That night I called Harriet. She said, Beverly, you are a 63-year-old woman who the mother of your daughter's fiancé essentially suggested should be hidden from the wedding photographer. And now they need you to bail them out of a property mistake. I said, I know. What are you going to do? I said, I don't know yet, but I'm going to meet with them. We met at Reg and Maureen's house. The kitchen island was just as large as I'd remembered. Maureen made coffee. Reg had printouts. Fletcher was there. Claudia sat beside me, and I noticed she had positioned her chair close to mine, which meant something to me. Reg explained the situation in the direct way that men like Reg explain financial difficulties, clinical, forward-facing, as little emotion as possible. The vacancy had lasted longer than projected. The lender wasn't flexible. They needed to either refinance, sell quickly at a loss, or find private bridge financing by April. The number he named was $240,000. Everyone in the room was looking at me with the polite, slightly pained expression of people who expect to be told no, who have already made peace with being told no, but who need to ask. I took a sip of coffee. I said, "Before we talk about the money, I want to say something, and I want everyone in this room to hear it." Maureen looked at her hands. She knew. I could see that she knew. I said, "At your party in October, I overheard a conversation about the wedding photos, about where I would be seated, about how things should look." The room was quiet. I said, "I want to be clear that I am not bringing this up to embarrass anyone. I'm bringing it up because I think it matters. My daughter is marrying into your family. I am her mother. I came to that party in good faith, and I heard myself described as someone who didn't fit." Maureen said quietly, "Beverly, I held up my hand. Gently. "I'm not asking for an apology right now. I'll get to that. I just want this on the table before we talk about anything else." Fletcher was looking at the printouts. Claudia was looking at me. I said, "Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to help you." Reg looked up. Not as charity, not as a loan from a sweet library lady who doesn't know any better. As a private lender with proper documentation, a reasonable interest rate, and a clear repayment schedule. My accountant will draw up the terms and your lawyer will review them. If they're fair, and they will be fair, you'll sign them." Reg said, I'm not finished," I said, not unkindly. "In exchange, I want two things. First, Claudia and I make our own decisions about the wedding, all of them, without input about how things should look or who stands where. Second," I looked at Maureen, "I'd like an honest conversation with you, just the two of us, not now, sometime before the wedding, because I think we started off wrong, and I'd like to do better. If you're willing." Maureen looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were wet. I hadn't expected that. She said, "I didn't realize you could hear me." I said, "I work at a library. We are professionally quiet. We notice everything." She laughed. It was a real laugh, not the other kind. We signed the paperwork in April. Gail supervised every word of it. Fair terms, market rate plus 1%, 24-month term. At the wedding in June, which was genuinely beautiful, at a vineyard near Niagara-on-the-Lake, the kind of Ontario summer evening that makes you remember why you live here, I stood in the family photos, all of them. I wore a dress I bought specifically for the occasion in a color my daughter called champagne sage, and I called fancy green. Walter's sister said I looked like myself, which is the best thing anyone has ever said to me about an outfit. At dinner, I was seated at the table with Claudia's friends from university, which was Claudia's choice, and they were loud and funny, and one of them told me I had excellent taste in wine when I helped choose a bottle, and I said, thank you, I'd been practicing. Maureen and I had our conversation in May, over lunch at a restaurant in Burlington. It was honest and a little uncomfortable, and by the end she told me that she had assumed things about me without ever asking, and that she was sorry. I told her I had assumed things about her too, and that I was sorry for that. I don't know if we'll ever be close, but we're something real. In July, I finally called the contractor about the cedar fence. I had it replaced with a proper cedar board fence, the same design, same dimensions. You can't really tell the difference from the street, but it's new and it's solid and it doesn't need patching anymore. I also got the bumper fixed. Finally. And the last Friday of every month, I still bring butter tarts to the library. I am still Biv from Holds. I like it that way. I have no plans to change it. What I know now, at 63, having built nothing dramatic and lost nothing permanently and made mostly small decisions that accumulated quietly over a long time, is this. The people who look at your life and decide they know its value from the outside, they're not seeing your life. They're seeing their story about your life, and there is nothing you can do to correct that story except live the real one, steadily, until the moment when the gap between those two things becomes impossible to ignore. I didn't set out to prove anything to Maureen. I set out to protect something. My relationship with my daughter. My sense of my own worth. The quiet dignity of a life I had actually built, even if it didn't look like much from the street. Walter used to say, a good foundation doesn't advertise itself. He was talking about the shop floor, about machinery that ran without drama, but I think he meant it the other way too. He usually did. I keep thinking about the cedar fence. For years I patched it instead of replacing it, not because I couldn't afford better, but because it was Walter's fence, and something in me wasn't ready to let go of the version of it that he'd built. I told myself it was frugality. I told myself it was sentiment. But if I'm honest, I think it was also a kind of hiding, a way of staying small inside a life that had quietly grown larger than I let anyone see. What Maureen saw when she looked at me was the patched fence, the dented bumper, the library desk. She made a story out of those things, and she let that story make decisions for her, decisions about my daughter's wedding, about where I should stand, about whether I fit. I don't entirely blame her for it. We all do this. We read the surface of a person and think we've read the whole book. But here's what I've come to understand. The cost of that kind of thinking isn't paid by the person being misjudged. Not really. The cost comes back to the one doing the judging in ways they don't always see coming. Maureen didn't set out to put herself in a position where she'd need to sit across from me at her own kitchen table, printouts in hand, asking for help. She just made a series of small, confident assumptions about who I was, about what I had, about what mattered. And those assumptions led her somewhere she hadn't planned to go. That's how it works in my experience, not dramatically, not like a punishment arriving from outside, just the ordinary weight of choices accumulating until the gap between what you assumed and what's actually true becomes too wide to step over. What I'm prouder of than anything, prouder than the portfolio, prouder than the King Street property, prouder than the fact that I was standing in every family photo at that vineyard in June, is that I didn't close the door. I could have. I had the leverage, and honestly, I had the hurt. But I sat at that table and I said what needed saying, and then I extended my hand anyway, not because I'm saintly, because I've lived long enough to know that winning a moment and losing a relationship aren't actually different things. Claudia needed to see her mother do that. I think she did see it. I think it changed something between us that needed changing. What I would say to anyone sitting with a version of what I sat with, the quiet sting of being dismissed, the long patience of a life that doesn't announce itself, is this: the intelligence you build over decades of paying attention, of managing carefully, of reading rooms and keeping your own counsel. That's not nothing. That's everything. It's a different kind of sharp than the kind that shows up in a pressed shirt and a firm handshake, but it cuts just as clean when it needs to. And the steadiness it takes to absorb an insult without collapsing and without retaliating badly, to feel the full weight of it, then decide deliberately what to do next, that's not weakness. That's the hardest thing I know how to do. Walter had it. I've been practicing it my whole life. The fence is new now. Same design, same cedar, same quiet corner of the yard. You can't really tell from the street, but it's solid, and it doesn't need patching, and every time I look at it I think, yes, that's about right.